Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner EU Bank, associate partner TDI Infratech, airline partner SpiceJet.
So here we are on this edition of Off the Cuff with Gideon Rachman, undoubtedly among the 3 or 4 most read foreign affairs columnists in the world, but also a very influential voice and somebody always willing to speak his mind. Gideon, welcome to Off the Cuff. I know that it's tough for all of us to work from home because all of us are not particularly introverted people. And I know there's a lot of work for you. So thank you very much for finding the time. And let's, without wasting any time, pick up the thread from where you left it with your last column, which led to a lot of interest in India. You made this very interesting comparison between Narendra Modi and Erdogan. So where are you coming from, and will you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. First of all, Shekhar, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure, actually, taking a break from my boring routine where I never leave the house. But on the column, so I just started initially just by noticing, as one does if you read the foreign pages of the newspapers, these two stories which were happening within a couple of weeks of each other: the Erdogan turning the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, and Modi and Ayodhya, and what was going on there. And it seemed to me that there was a certain similarity, at least outwardly. But then when I sort of dug into it, it seemed to me that the broader project that both men both leaders are doing have similarities in the sense that they're both uneasy with, some would say, in a mild sense, at war with the kind of secular foundations of the states that they inherited or that they became leaders of. So that, to take the Turkish case, Turkey is founded, but the Turkish Republic was founded by Ataturk, who very much wanted to turn Turkey into a secular state. It was him that turned the Hagia Sophia into a museum. And Erdogan came up in the same way that Modi came up through Hindu nationalism and Hindutva and all that. Erdogan came up through an Islamist political party, which was at war with the country's establishment. In his case, he was imprisoned briefly, but then he emerged. He became the leader in 2003, and he's gradually been pushing this Islamist agenda to the extent that many secular Turks are now extremely anxious. I mean, talking to them, they actually saw the Hagia Sophia moment as less important than some other things that Erdogan has done, for example, to the changes to universities, changes to rules around alcohol, etc., etc. But nonetheless, it's part of a process of turning Turkey back into a much more self-consciously Islamic state. And it seems to me that there are strong parallels with what Modi is doing in India, where, again, he's saying not that comfortable. The people around him are saying they're not comfortable with the secular legacy. India has to be much more overtly a Hindu country. And so the symbolism of these two things happening within weeks of each other seem to me very strong. And I think a couple of other similarities. They're both, if you like, strongman leaders, leaders who've associated themselves with the rejuvenation of the nation and the nation with faith rather than some other kind of cultural heritage. They're both leaders who are unpopular with the liberal elite in their countries, but who draw a lot of strength from the kind of middle class and lower middle class outside the capital cities. So I think there are strong parallels between the two leaders, and perhaps they're both symptomatic of a broader trend in global politics towards what I'd call strongman leadership.
Well, interesting fact I'd like to underline to you is that both India and Pakistan, two very differently constructed nationalisms, two very differently constructed approaches to religion, to secularism, and to Islam. And yet the capitals of both countries have sizable avenues named after Ataturk.
Huh. That I did not know. Very interesting. Absolutely. And, Ataturk what he represented in a way, or the assault on the sort of Ataturk legacy. And I think they're careful about it in the same way that Modi is careful in the way he talks about Nehru and Gandhi. I don't think Erdogan will actually disrespect Ataturk by name directly, but his followers certainly will. And there'll be people who put out the idea that, well, Ataturk was, had betrayed parts of the heritage of Turkey. But often it'll be done in sort of code or indirectly or by supporters rather than directly by the leader himself.
And it's a bit like that with, say, Gandhi in India or Nehru in India.
Yeah, that's my feeling. I mean, you know the country obviously far better than I do, but I remember, in fact, last time I was in Delhi where we were talking about this, and you said that a lot of the more radical messages were put out not directly by Modi himself, but as you put it, I think, he doesn't say these things. He just has selfies taken with people who do. And I think that's sort of, I mean, actually Erdogan is a much less controlled figure in his rhetoric than Modi. He is given to big conspiracy theories, to say that people in the West want to kill Turks and so on. In that sense, he's less controlled. But I think his relationship to the secular legacy, where he is clearly undermining it, but equally not prepared yet to say that Ataturk was a bad guy, not directly, not himself.
Now, Gideon, look at the state of the world. Look at the picture, the map of the world as you see it. And many things have happened. The pandemic is the one, but there is the rise of Xi. Now there seems to be some kind of a pushback against Xi Jinping as well in China, at least if you read The Guardian and Wall Street Journal last couple of days. Mm-hmm. There is also uncertainty in America, Trump or Biden or what happens. And much is happening, say, in our part of Asia. With UAE, with more and more Islamic countries, Arab countries, and Israel now tying up. The other axis emerging with Turkey, Pakistan, maybe Iran, we don't know. Maybe Malaysia, we don't know yet. So this world is strategic map is being redrawn right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unavoidably the most important things are happening in the biggest countries, because they're the countries that people sort of fix their place in the world around. So what happens in the United States in the election, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Firstly, because in strategic terms, but also because of what America represents. So that in strategic terms, I think if Trump were to be reelected, you would see a further estrangement between the United States and the European Union, and possibly an intensification even more of this kind of rivalry with China, although some of that I think is for electoral purposes, but Trump does seem to have got the bit between his teeth on that issue. But I think also importantly, it would be America would lose a lot of what Joe Nye calls soft power, this ability to attract, to say the reason you should be on the American side in any global conflict is not just because we're rich and powerful, but also because we represent a more attractive model, an open society, open to the outside world. Where you look at the way that Trump is cracking down on immigration, those kinds of soft power aspects of the United States, I think, have already been diminished by Trump. But I think if he were reelected, it would be even worse. Whereas I think if you have Biden reelected, it won't go back to the way it was before Trump. I don't think America can sort of disinvent or that era. But nonetheless, I mean, I think you would have a reassertion of the importance of alliances. I think actually, as far as India is concerned, it's probably a country which is less likely to be affected by the change, because I think for strategic reasons, successive American presidents, Bush and Obama, now Trump, and then Biden, if it is Biden, will see India as absolutely critical as a counterweight to China. So I think the Indian position would be less directly affected in strategic terms. So I think things like immigration would be importantly affected. The China thing, I think that you mentioned, it is intriguing, these stories that you refer to about dissent within the Communist Party, but frankly, it's so hard to know how broadly it goes, because it's a closed society. So, I mean, I know, or I've met some of these kind of brave academics who stick their heads above the parapets and who are destroyed, if they go against the party. I suspect that probably there's a lot of people who quietly admire them, but it's also my impression that China is, after 20, 30 years of indoctrination through the school system and other things, a highly nationalistic society. So there may be strong support for Xi as well. And I think one of the dangers is that to the extent that Xi is in trouble domestically, the incentive for him to have confrontations internationally, for example, over Taiwan, which are unifying issues, or indeed with India, rises. So China, even if it is unstable domestically, may become harder to deal with internationally. So those are the, you mentioned all sorts of other things, what's happening in the Middle East, Israel, etc. All of those things are interesting. But it seems to me the two biggest strategic issues for all of us remain what's happening in the US, what's happening in China, and probably the relationship between the two. Because the last thing I'll end on this segment, if you like, is I think that the breakdown in the US-Chinese relationship will have implications for everybody, because the whole system of economic globalization has been built around the US-Chinese relationship, if you like. It's the most important economic relationship in the world. The Apple iPhone that I'm waving at you is an American product made there, etc. And that's just a single symbolic example. Now, if the two countries try and cut ties, we're all affected, because suddenly we may be subject to American sanctions if we do business with China, or the Chinese may punish us, by, trying to shut out Indian or British companies in China if you're seen to be moving towards America. So it will become a much more bifurcated world, and a world in which I think globalization, certainly as we've got used to it, begins to go into reverse.
I think next time you are in Delhi, we'll help you buy an iPhone made in India, not in China, and buy a Taiwanese company, Foxconn.
Absolutely. In fact, in the article I just wrote, that was one of the things I pointed out, was that it's very interesting that iPhone, Apple, which have put so much of their bets, their chips, on China, are seeing the way things are going and are now beginning to assemble the iPhone in India.
So, Gideon, how much of this tension this breakdown between US and China, as you said, that is the central thing right now. How much of that is for real, and how much of it is WWE on the eve of elections in America?
That's a big question. I don't think we can be totally sure. I mean, to be honest, I don't think even Trump knows. He's a very volatile guy. And I think that his playbook was fairly clear until COVID hit, which was to have a row with China, get a trade deal in time to boost the economy ahead of the election, and then say, look how tough I am. I've been a great trade deal maker. But I think post-COVID, he's looking around for other ways of winning the election, to put it bluntly, and running against China makes sense. So that suggests that maybe it is a kind of electoral thing. But I think set against that is the fact that there are a lot of people around Trump, Peter Navarro, the trade guy, Matt Pottinger, who's the deputy national security advisor, who's a China expert, who have been waiting a long time for an opportunity to really fundamentally change the US-China relationship, who believe that America basically made a mistake 40 years ago when it opened up to China. Indeed, Mike Pompeo more or less said the same thing when he gave a speech about Henry Kissinger and Nixon's opening, where he said, we got it wrong. So I think that group that really wants to change things is very powerful and are now making changes that may be quite hard to reverse. And I think the other thing to note is that this isn't just a Republican Party thing. So that, for example, there was a bill that went before the Senate in May saying that Chinese companies would be forced to delist from the New York Stock Exchange unless they opened their books to American regulators. Now, you would think that that would be kind of unpopular with very influential group, Wall Street banks, which make a lot of money by launching Chinese companies in America. But actually, it passed unanimously in the Senate, which tells you that a lot of Democrats, as well, all Democrats in this case, were in line with this, which again tells you that the notion of a China threat is very strong now in America. And I was talking to a friend who works on the Biden team, who'd written something that I actually thought was quite mild about China. And I said, I was surprised that he'd been quite careful. And he said, yeah, well, actually, I could have put it more strongly, but I'm very wary of America's tendency to overshoot, so that when the whole of the American establishment decides something has to be done, they can become over-determined, and then they go and invade Iraq or make a massive policy error when there stops being dissent. And this guy thinks the bigger concern is not that America will wind back this antagonism after the election, but more that it will become a kind of self-fulfilling thing in which it's impossible to really do anything with China. And given climate change and other issues, that too is a danger.
Gideon, you've been studying these issues for a long time, in depth, and for the long term. What is your sense? Do you buy into the theory that Kissinger and Nixon made a big error at that point? Because that changed the world in the 70s.
No, I don't. I mean, I think for sort of humanitarian reasons, it just, and probably, diplomatic reasons, it just wasn't ever going to be tenable in the long run to keep China as this isolated, massive entity boiling away in its own juice, never making any progress. I do think that, strict superpower rivalry aside, the transformation in China economically has been remarkable, and absolute poverty, which was so high 40 years ago, is now more or less eradicated in China. So on the sort of life chances of individuals, I think it's hard to say that should never have happened. And it was closely associated with the opening of China. I think what has been a disappointment is the hope that China, the Communist Party, would cede power and that China would become a more open society. And, people clung to that hope probably too long. And then I think with the coming of Xi Jinping in 2012, we've seen that it's actually not only not opening up, it's becoming more closed. Right. And somebody who, at least until COVID struck, used to go to China at least once a year. And so you can see the kinds of conversations that used to have changing. So I remember, maybe 6-7 years ago, going out with a bunch of Chinese academics to a dinner in a restaurant in Beijing. And they were prepared, they were members of the same university, but they were prepared to have an open discussion in front of a foreigner in a public place about whether China should become a democracy. And it was a very passionate, open, interesting thing to see. Some people said, no, that would be a terrible error, but there were other people who were saying, absolutely, we've got to end one-party rule. Now, that discussion would never take place now. Nobody would dare to do that. And that, I think, is a sign of how things have tightened up in a very regressive and regrettable way. Was it inevitable? No. I mean, I don't think it's... I think we were naive about thinking that China would change, but I don't think it had to go backwards in the way that Xi Jinping has. That could just be a kind of accident of Chinese politics, but it makes China a more threatening place, I think, because it's tied up with nationalism. And it also, you think suddenly, as a Westerner, if this country is going to become the most powerful country in the world and begins to export its model in the way that the United States has when it was the most powerful country in the world, then that is a very bleak prospect for all of us. I mean, the Chinese will say, oh, well, we don't do that. We're not kind of universalists like the Americans. But actually, they do it. I mean, you can see it in the way in which they try to control speech in foreign countries so that, we are not allowed, as far as they're concerned, to talk about the Uyghurs, to say that, well, maybe Taiwan should be an independent country. And if you do that, or if you give a Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo or whatever, there will be retaliation against either your institution or your country. So China is intent on spreading its controls on freedom of speech. And that, I think, is something that makes it clear that this isn't just a kind of conventional superpower rivalry about who's going to be the top dog. It's about how we all live in the long run.
So you talked about giving Nobel Prizes to people from Taiwan and Chinese dissidents. think of the Dalai Lama. If a media group in India at its annual conclave invites a Dalai Lama, it gets retaliatory action from the Chinese. So it works that way. Now, do you think it is this same nationalism or the use of the nationalism to distract attention? What is driving the Chinese into this new conflict with India, which didn't have to happen?
Yeah, I think that's almost the single most incomprehensible Chinese action, because why do it? They've got enough troubles, they've got the South China Sea, they've got this historic conflict that they claim they want to settle with Taiwan, they've got the world on their back over Xinjiang. This border dispute's been going for decades. To try to push it so aggressively that you kill Indian soldiers, and it seems to me, again, you're there, I'm not, but potentially risk a permanent shift in Indian opinion to viewing China as an adversary, pushing India much closer to the Quad, something that India had been, quite careful about how closely it was going to get involved with all this, beginning to damage China, the market share of major Chinese companies in this huge market next door to them. It's madness. Just on a strategic level. Now, I think that there are two possible explanations. One is very dark, that the Chinese really are on a kind of aggressive rampage and want to settle all these disputes and use force if necessary. The second, I think, possibly related to it, is that they underestimated the strength of the Indian reaction. And that they also, I think, if you read papers like the Global Times, there is a very dismissive attitude to India. They will say, well, look, their economy is 1/5 the size of ours. We're much more sophisticated in military terms. What are they going to do? They're going to have to suck it up. And, by the way, America's completely unreliable. So, we're going to just show them that we're more powerful and this is the way to do it. And in the long run, they'll have to come to terms with it. Now, it seems to me that is, the figures about the economies and the military gap are correct, but it is a miscalculation of the long-term effects of alienating a very large neighbor, the second superpower of Asia, essentially, which seems to me a massive strategic blunder. But again, it's part of this problem is what we were talking about earlier, that China is a bit of a black box. If America or indeed India had made a decision like this, a lot of the debate would leak out into the public or would be carried out on television, and you'd have a sense of who was arguing for what. Who made this decision, why it was made, very hard to tell. Was it some kind of local initiative? I suspect it can't have been, because I think that China is such a tightly controlled society that no local commander would be willing to take a risk like that without the say-so Xi Jinping.
The amount of forces they've moved in from behind, the heavy stuff, it cannot be a local initiative.
Yeah. What was your reading of it? Or maybe I'm not allowed to ask you questions.
No. Well, I'm happy to engage.
Yeah.
I do think it is to tell India who the boss is.
Yeah.
And I think it seems over the last couple of years' interactions, Xi Jinping has got the impression that Narendra Modi thinks that he is an equal to him and that India is an equal to China. So there's a bit of that coming out. There is also support for Pakistan. And there is also payback for India making the big changes in Kashmir last year.
Right.
Because remember, it was a few years back that the Chinese began to say that they shared 2,000 kilometers of border with India, not 3,400 or 500, because suddenly they started excluding the border in Ladakh. So indicating that they don't think it's a settled territory.
Right.
So I think the Chinese are increasing the flow of water in the tap. And they know that America is unreliable, particularly under Trump, America is unreliable. And there is no way the Japanese and the Australians are going to war with them.
Yeah, no, I think it reminds me a little bit of a discussion I've often had. There's a very clever Australian strategist called Hugh White, who you may know, but he's been against the the Australian government has really put its chips on the United States increasingly.
Absolutely.
And Hugh, although he's, a very, in some ways, pro-American guy, he basically shares the Chinese analysis, which is that in the end, the Americans aren't going to fight over this. And he has always seen the confrontation as not necessarily over India. I mean, I think he thinks that China will take some very powerful action, such as attacking Taiwan or doing something very, having a confrontation in the South China Sea, and that America won't fight. And that at that point, you'll see a power transition, at least in the region. And that given that scenario, he thinks, he's actually in favor of Australia developing nuclear weapons and so on, because he doesn't think that it can rely in the long run on the American security guarantee. And that's not, we all let our emotions and our analysis get merged, so if you don't want that to happen, you tend to say it will never happen. But sometimes you have to just look at the world as it is. And I think he might be right. But of course, the thing that the Chinese have to think about is, what if he's wrong? Or what if the Americans fight in the short term? Or what if there's an escalation? You can never be sure. And the other kind of interesting group, I think, to talk to on this, the Japanese, who also have to think very, very hard about this. And again, it's slightly self-excusing, but some people around Abe have said to me, I don't know if you've heard this, that they see China as like Japan in the 1930s, as essentially making a decision to challenge American power in the Asia Pacific. And that they say, look, that led to disaster for us. And one of these Abe people said to me, the difficulty is, I hope it will lead to disaster for China, obviously, because China hates Japan. But when we made that decision, our economy was about 10% the size of America's. And China's now at about 40, closing in on 50%. And, in purchasing power parity terms, larger than America. So they have a better chance of doing it if they actually take on America.
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting point. All I could add to this is that there is no expectation in India that push comes to the shove, Americans will come to fight for us. Yeah. But there is also no expectation or no apprehension in India that India will not fight back quite adequately. So the price that will entail on the Chinese will be quite heavy.
Well, India is a country of, well over 1 billion people. Obviously, Taiwan is a different thing. It's it's a small island.
But there is also nationalism. There are also nuclear weapons, nationalism.
Sure.
So Chinese nationalism and Indian nationalism collide. It will be two immovable objects.
Totally, yeah.
And sizable countries. Now, Gideon, my colleague Nainema Bose, Nainema Basu, who is our diplomatic editor, she quotes from something you said in 2016. You said in 2016, Obama to Trump and beyond. So is Biden the beyond?
Well, Biden's in a way back to it's the Democrats in a way signaling we can go back, that he was Obama's deputy, and I think that it touches on this question we were discussing earlier. Can you go back? I remember at the time when Americans were still assimilating the shock of Trump's victory, a friend of mine wrote an article in which he said, whatever happens, we will always be the nation that elected Donald Trump as our president. And I think that you can't erase those 4 years, and nor can you erase the changes in the world that have happened since then. So although Biden would represent continuity from the Obama years in some senses, a lot of the people around him making foreign policy would be the same people. People like sort of Jake Sullivan and Tom Donilon and would be tipped, maybe even Susan Rice as Secretary of State, would be tipped to come back. But they would find a world that had changed fundamentally, a more powerful China, a weakened America, a European Union that's breaking up, or that at least Britain has left, Modi very well entrenched in power in India. And then so I think they would have to start again. They couldn't just say, okay, let's just pick up where we left off. They'd have to make some kind of assessment of, well, what is this world that we face now? And I think that they would start by doing quite conventional things like trying to rebuild America's alliances, but they would quite quickly face whole new challenges. Indeed, I think, climate, which Obama tried to make a central thing, is feeling increasingly urgent now. And I suspect that would be a big approach. But I think maybe the last thing, actually, and beyond, is that even though we regard Trump as some kind of crazy outlier, or most people I know do, actually he may have brought about two very consequential changes that last. The first is this shift in attitude towards China, which I think will last. And the second is a much, much more skeptical attitude to globalization. And again, I did a seminar a little bit like this with another of the Biden advisors, a guy called Tony Blinken. And Blinken was talking to Europeans. And so a lot of what he was saying was very reassuring. It's all going to, the America you loved, it's going to come back, it's all fine. And I said, well, look, Trump was elected, and he was elected by people who felt the old system wasn't working and that globalization had worked badly for them. What are you going to say to those people? And at that point, it seemed to me, maybe I'm just praising my own question, but it seemed to me that Blinken sort of came alive. And he said, yeah, that's absolutely right. We can't just say globalization as it was working before is fine. We're going to have to rethink our trade relations with the whole world. So I think that you will have a more protectionist America under Biden as well, and a less globalist America under Biden as well. I think what one can hope, though, is that these policies that were, maybe it took a kind of wild man like Trump to produce this two major shifts against what had been an elite consensus. But Trump is so wild that he applies the policies in ways that are inconsistent, self-serving, dangerous. You may get a Biden administration that actually adopts the central thrust of those policies, but applies them in ways that are easier for the outside world to understand and deal with.
So a Biden-Kamala Harris administration, how do you see them relating to Modi?
Look, hard to know. I don't know what Kamala Harris thinks about Hindu nationalism or about the controversies around, is India becoming more authoritarian under Modi? There have been a few small things like when I gathered that when the Foreign Minister Jaishankar addressed people in Congress and attempted to exclude Indian American Congresswoman who was a critic of Modi's, that Kamala Harris was upset about that. But that might just be solidarity towards a colleague, difficult to tell. Her record suggests she's a deeply pragmatic person, that she has been at times on the progressive left-wing wing, then she was a prosecutor who was putting people into prison and doing things the left hate. She was a deep critic of Biden, really slammed Biden in the primaries. Now she's his running mate. So, I suspect she's a fairly adaptable person, and that she will look at America's strategic interests. And as I said before, successive presidents have come to the conclusion that India is crucial. I think the one difference, perhaps, is that because of her background, she will have a much more nuanced and deep understanding of India than anyone who's been in that position of power before. She'll have lines open to India that other American politicians didn't have. So that there'll be people who will be in her ear saying bad stuff is happening if Modi is doing things that outrage Indian liberals. Whether she responds to that or not is not as clear, but I think she'll be certainly more knowledgeable. And to the extent that Modi relies on foreigners just saying, oh, India, world's greatest democracy, marvelous, marvelous. Oh, it's a bit more complicated than that. Well, don't bother me with the details. I think Kamala Harris will have a more detailed understanding, and that could be a little bit difficult.
Yeah. So big powers or nations relate to each other in terms of their national interest. How important is this thing called personal chemistry, if you look around the world? And two, if Biden picks up the thread from Trump on the basis that a relationship with India is very important. So how would that impact on India given the difference in personalities of Trump and Biden?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question that you raise. Does personal chemistry matter, or in the end, do big powers make decisions based on their interests and so on? I mean, I think the personality of the individual does matter a bit. I mean, you can see it, for example, in Erdogan, who we were talking about earlier, who's somebody who's a very emotional, who has feuds with people. On the other hand, even Erdogan, having shot down a Russian plane, made very sure to go to Moscow and to get on with Putin and to calm it down, because in the end, it wasn't in Turkey's interest. So I think that I would be more on the line that national interests tend to dictate, except maybe in a place like China, where you have now, a full-blown cult of personality. It's very, very hard for people to go against Xi. And so I think if Xi were to really start making serious mistakes, the possibility for the system to correct in an authoritarian system is smaller. But I mean, I think in terms of personal chemistry, look, Biden is famously a kind of warm guy who, I remember somebody who worked in the Obama-Biden White House saying to me, it was almost comic working with Biden and Obama, because Obama actually, although he's got a beautiful smile, is really quite a chilly person. When you work with him, he wasn't, particularly hands-on, Biden was always hugging people and high-fiving them and so on. That's kind of who he is. I think Modi's quite a tactile person, so maybe they'll spend a lot of time hugging each other. I don't know, but I think that that Biden will. He is a retail politician, so he is the kind of person who will look to create a personal bond, and I think that possibly more than the rather chilly Obama and the very erratic and Donald Trump, there's more of a chance of a close Biden-Modi relationship, because they're both people who look to do that, build a personal relationship. The only thing I'd say is that we're in weird times. In COVID-19, will they even get to meet in person? Will they be able to travel? Plus, Biden is old. And, do we know that the Biden of this year is going to be the Biden of 2 years' time? I mean, maybe Kamala Harris will become very important.
Yeah. So I'm coming back to China, since you said personality cult. So these revelations or claims of this Chinese dissident, I'm not mentioning her name because I'm so bad with Chinese pronunciation.
Me too, yeah.
Kai Xie? You might get it better than me. The interview in The Guardian.
Yes.
There's one line that says that she has made China the enemy of the world. One, do you think that's correct? And second, how do you think will that ring in China?
I don't think Chinese people will necessarily hear that. I think it'll be censored. And to the extent that they do, they will... Look, it's hard to say, obviously. It's a huge country. It's 1.4 billion people, and people will have different reactions. But I wouldn't underestimate Chinese nationalism. I mean, I've yet to meet, other than a fully blown dissident, any Chinese national who's really sympathetic with what's going on in Hong Kong. I think that they feel affronted by it, and they've been brought up in a very nationalistic educational system. So, although a lot of Chinese people, it's one of the good things about what's happened over the last 40 years, know the world much better than they would ever have done. They've been educated overseas. They often speak English, at least in the middle class. They may have gone as tourists to Europe or to Japan. I think that the nationalism is quite strong. So the idea that China has, that people hate China and that's China's fault is not going to go down very well, any more than that, a similar sentiment would go down well in India. No. But I think that amongst, that would probably the popular reaction. However, I think amongst the diplomats and the kind of the people who really have to engage with what China's doing in the world professionally, and who in the end might be the core of some sort of opposition to Xi, if that were ever to take place. My sense is there is a concern about that. I mean, again, Chinese officials have to be unbelievably careful because the costs of falling out or seeing disloyal are, career ending. I don't know if you've noticed, but whenever I meet Chinese diplomats, they always come in twos. And
right.
And there's a reason for that. It's so that
my experience too, because one keeps an eye on the other.
Totally, exactly. So that you can't. So the costs of saying something, they stick to the party line, literally. But then occasionally you'll get an insight that there's something else going on, or they'll, I remember. I don't want to put anybody in trouble, but so it's a few years back. But it was a dinner in Beijing involving this same scenario. There were several people there, so nobody was going to break ranks. But then there was one point where one of them was on their own with me. And for literally because one person went to get the door and another went to the toilet. And there was 2 minutes. And in that 2 minutes, this person said, I'm very worried. We're antagonizing the whole world. Some of this has to be our fault, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, God, what happened there? And then, of course, the other people came back to the table and the discourse came back to, the official line. But that was just a sort of brief sense that behind the scenes, I think there are people who think, actually, we've made a terrible mistake, that there was an alternative path open for China, which was just use the size of its economy to tie countries more and more into a Chinese world where you don't have to browbeat them. They know what their interests are. They come to admire you, and you don't have to throw your weight around. You allow economic power to do its work. But I think that China's forced the pace under Xi. All the things we've talked about before, and it's frightened people. And so there's been this change in opinion that we talk about in the United States. There's been this change of opinion in India, in my own country, the UK, albeit under American pressure partly, some change in Europe. But equally, I don't think we should underestimate the large parts of the world that are still quite receptive to China because of all the kind of financial goodies that go with being part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Central Asia, Pakistan, obviously, others of India's neighbors, large parts of Africa where it's the Chinese who are building the roads, the stadiums, the office blocks, the Chinese who have the money to throw around. So I don't think, you can say, the whole world's turned against China. I don't think that at all. But I think that they have made some enemies. Australia is another one. I don't think that's in China's, long-term interests.
Well, the public opinion loss in India is massive, and I think it's going to be very long-lasting because after 2 generations, some Indians have begun to trust China. It's over now. I think it'll take 2 more generations. So that loss is permanent. Because we are also emotional people. Chinese don't have the...
Look, anybody would be. I don't think it's unusual if you have 20 of your soldiers killed in a kind of brutal way. I think most countries would learn a lesson from that, and there would be a lasting antagonism.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I have a question from Navneet Munot, one of our guests, who runs SBI Mutual Fund, who wants to know, he praises EU for having come up with the recovery plan, and he asks, can Merkel-Macron-led Europe be a dark horse in a new multipolar world which is obsessed with US-China headlines?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've all been waiting a long time for the development of an EU foreign policy, and we may wait a long while yet. The EU isn't a conventional foreign policy actor like a state, in the sense it doesn't have its own military, it doesn't take it takes foreign policy decisions by unanimity, and therefore, different countries disagree, so that there are very different attitudes, for example, to Russia in Poland and in Spain. There are different attitudes to China in Germany and in France even, and different emphasis. So the French are interested in North Africa, the Germans more interested in kind of Eastern Europe and in relations with China. But I do think that the EU has a good chance of developing a more coherent approach, because it comes back to the kind of thing we were talking about earlier, interests. I think as the European nations look around the world, a lot of them, or at least the foreign policy elite, will come to realize that you have this one huge bloc, the United States, you have the other as China, that individual European countries, even a country as large as France or Germany, doesn't have much chance pushing back as a country of 80 million of Germany, certainly not as a country of 40 million like Poland. But as a collective of close to 500 million and the world's largest internal market, they have power. And they can, for example, force the big Californian tech companies to change their behavior. They can threaten Chinese market access in a way that would actually register in Beijing in a way that it wouldn't register if it was just one of the European countries. They can prevent China from playing this game of divide and rule. So I think people do realize that it makes sense for Europe to act together where they can. And there've been, although the European Union often looks like a terrible mess, they often can act in extremis. They did prevent Greece from falling out of the euro, and they have now launched this very interesting thing of raising money on the financial markets. And if they do that consistently, not just because of COVID, then potentially the EU has a huge new source of cheap funding there, because people want alternatives to the dollar. The Chinese currency isn't tradable. The euro is tradable. And if you can borrow at very low interest rates, get big market acts, a lot of investors around the world interested, then that's potentially another source of European power, which is beginning to develop. So on balance, I'm mildly optimistic about the European Union. I think they will tend closer to the United States for reasons of values and strategic interests, but I don't think they will be synonymous with American policy. There won't be a single West. There'll be a West with two pillars if it works. The United States on one hand, the European Union on the other.
So before we come to the concluding questions from my managing editor, YP Rajesh, because we talked about Europe and now this becoming two pillars of the West. So how does Europe handle a situation like Greece and Turkey now? And why are the Turks doing what they are doing with Greece?
Well, Erdogan likes to throw his weight around, and I think maybe he is counting on the European Union struggling to get its act together. The EU is a bit divided. When the French, for example, tried to confront Turkey in the Eastern Med, they didn't get the whole of the EU behind them. And when I think only 10 of the 29 NATO countries rallied behind France. But Erdogan is, as I say, this could be famous last words. Maybe a war will break out in the next few days. But I think that he is quite a calculating guy and that he won't risk a war with Greece, because it will be a really interesting test, not just of NATO, but of European Union solidarity. Is there a de facto defense guarantee within the EU? How many EU nations will feel they have to come in behind Greece, even if they don't fully back them, because it's a member of the club? If I were Erdogan, I wouldn't want to test that. I mean, he may be right. It's a bit like what we were saying about China and Taiwan and so on. You might get away with it. You might find that the European Union just collapsed, ignored this. But there's a strong possibility that the opposite would happen, and that the European Union would feel that it had to be seen to act, and Turkey would blow up its relationship with the EU. So my guess is that Erdogan is pushing it because he has a number of cards to play: strengthened situation in Libya, the refugees, which he can always kind of start sending towards Europe and so on. But I hope that on balance, this is just very rough diplomacy rather than the prelude to war.
So in conclusion, two questions for my managing editor, and I will read out both and you can answer both together. One, will Brexit make Britain great again? And second, does the West overestimate Russia's capacity to make mischief globally?
Well, define great. No, I don't think that Britain is going to return to being the global power that it once was. That's clearly ridiculous. I think that there are more and less positive scenarios. Obviously, living here, I would like to believe in the positive ones. The positive ones would be that there's some disruption to the economy, but in the long run, we have a workable relationship with the European Union, that the British eventually reconcile their social divisions that have opened up around Brexit, and that we become something like Canada to the European Union's United States, a important middle-ranking power, a successful economy that manages a relationship with a larger neighbor that it's not part of and doesn't particularly want to join. That would be an okay outcome. There are other much more disruptive scenarios, which include a permanently scratchy relationship with the EU, and indeed the breakup of Britain. So Britain not only doesn't become great again, but it actually stops being Britain at all, because Scotland has a referendum and votes to be independent. And that's becoming, I think, really quite possible in the next 3-4 years. So that would be a bit of a calamity for Britain. But even there, I hope that the English will just, do the English thing and shrug their shoulders and get on with it. Sorry, what was the last question? It was Brexit and...
Does the West overestimate Russia's capacity?
Oh, well, yes and no. I mean, the thing is that Russia has in economic terms, very weak cards. It's an economy roughly the size of Italy. But it does have other things. And somebody said to me that Putin is a master playing a weak hand very well. What it does have is a vast territory, the most nuclear weapons in the world other than the United States, and a leader who's prepared to use military force to take risks. Whether that's benefited the Russian people, questionable. The Russian living standards, certainly better than they were in the 1990s, but now pretty stagnant, and Russia suffers from some of the economic isolation that's been a consequence of Putin's foreign policy. But again, it comes back to the nationalism that we were talking about in the Chinese context, the American context, the Indian context. Nationalism is on the rise all over the world, and Putin has played to that quite effectively. So, yeah, I wouldn't be one of those who would dismiss Russia, because they're weak economically, but they're strong militarily, and they are prepared to do dangerous things, arguably immoral things, but it makes them a country that you can't discount.
So that means Russia keeps on punching above its weight.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the thing is that the people they punch are quite small. They can punch Ukraine, they can punch Georgia, they can punch Belarus. I think that, at the time of the Ukrainian intervention, the most alarming scenarios had Russia attempting to take back the Baltic states. But I just don't think that will happen, because they're in NATO, they're in the European Union, they know that's gone. But countries that are not aligned with a major Western alliance, that are smaller, weaker, and within Russia's orbit, they'll do that if they feel the need to. And they will also do big, risky things like murdering people on British territory and sort of saying, well, what are you going to do about it? And again, I think that, we were talking about China maybe not understanding the way that India was going to react to what happened on your soil. And maybe it's one of the problems with big countries which are run on authoritarian lines. They don't necessarily understand how other countries are going to react. So I think the Russians were taken by surprise by the strength of the British reaction to the murder of or the attempted murder of Skripal. They thought, well, whatever, they'll get over it. So they can also misjudge the consequences for them of some of these actions. For example, the lasting enmity on the left in America to them because of the intervention in the US election. these things I don't think have been good for Russia in the long term. But because Putin is a former KGB guy, he kind of runs operations. He does things like killing people, intervening in others' elections. He is, as Fiona Hill's book put it, an operative in the Kremlin. And he's got a powerful intelligence agency that can do things. Whether they're things that are helpful to Russia in the long run, I would dispute, but they can do them.
But in conclusion, a question from me, a philosophical question. So now liberal forces all of the world right now, or I don't say on the back foot because I know cricket and I think back foot is not necessarily defensive. People can attack on the back foot.
They're expecting a cover drive from the liberals at any point.
Yes, so they are on the ropes right now. So if liberals have to recover against this double weapon of or double-edged sword of nationalism and identity, what option do the liberals have?
Well, I mean, I think some of this is cyclical because, I mean, I think that people are in revolt against liberalism after a very long period of liberal hegemony, at which point a lot of the weaknesses in the liberal, no system is perfect. And our system, certainly in the West, produced a complacent elite, an embrace of globalization that was perhaps too unthinking, that benefited some groups that didn't benefit others, maybe an elite that moved too fast in imposing its own kind of cultural norms on society as a whole, whatever. There are numbers of criticisms you can make. And then you get the backlash in different forms in different countries. But then I think that, authoritarianism also, as we know, and as we found out in 1989 across Europe, also has deep problems with it. The corruption it breeds, the dishonesty, the restrictions on freedom that people begin to chafe against, the unfairness that inevitably proliferates in the system, et cetera, et cetera. And that also produces a revolt. I mean, look at what's happening in Belarus now. Look at what's happening in Thailand now. This is just this week. People don't, in the long run, like being run by authoritarian systems for a mixture of economic reasons and reasons to do with dignity. So I think that there's a sort of self-correcting mechanism. Now, that's not great if you're a liberal who may have to wait 20 years for the backlash, particularly since authoritarians tend to, as they sense threats, become more and more authoritarian. So it's not like you're in a steady state. Liberalism gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and to the point where, we started with Turkey, so why not end there? A lot of my Turkish friends who I've known for many years are now in exile or have been arrested. A couple of them are in prison. It gets really nasty. And I think for those people, they're very tough choices, about their own lives, and people respond in different ways, some with incredible bravery and integrity. Others say, okay, well, I'm going to take a step back and just, maybe not be a journalist. I'll do another thing that doesn't drag me into politics. They're very difficult personal choices that people have to make if they feel that this assault on liberal values isn't just like a general thing that they dislike, but something that affects their own lives. But I mean, I hope that that it's kept within constraints, at least in the countries that, as they say, I know best, that it hasn't. I don't feel the constraint on freedom of speech in the UK, even though there has been a sort of backlash against liberalism. There's a more angry debate. People are nastier to each other. But it's not like anybody's scared to say what they think, I don't think yet. I don't think it'll happen in Britain, but it is happening in other democratic countries. And, as I say, I think in the long run, you can it will swing back. But in the medium term, it's a question of kind of sticking to your principles and hoping for improvement.
Yes, you have to stay the course. So thank you very much, Gideon. This has been such a marvelous conversation. It's such a pity we can't welcome you to India sometime very soon, but at some point soon enough, it'll happen.
I'd love to hear that. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to being able to travel, particularly travel to India again.
Yes, to our conversation again. And take care, look after yourself. Your voice is very, very, very important.
Thanks, Shekhar. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Gideon.